A few years ago, I was given this book, Days That Shook the World. It's a history book about important moments from the past. There are entries in this book about kings and queens and rulers. There are entries about war and peace. There are entries in this book about power and technology. This is a book all about days that shook the world. I wonder if I asked you, what would be the days that you think shook the world? What would you think of? What would you suggest for days, momentous events that shook the world? Any suggestions? The Berlin Wall coming down. 9/11. Hiroshima. That was what you were going to say. Discovering fire. That's a good one. Absolutely a momentous day in human history. Discovering how to make fire. Absolutely. I think there are lots of others as well, aren't there? Things a long time ago, things recently. One of the things in my lifetime that I think has shaken the world more than anything else is 9/11 and what happened on September the 11th, 2001. I wonder where you were that day. Can you remember? I can. I was on a training course at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, and we watched in horror as the Twin Towers fell. The events of that day and their consequences have rippled around the world ever since. We're still living in the shadow of 9/11. The Iraq War, the Arab Spring, the Syrian civil war, Afghanistan, and to an extent, even the war in Ukraine. All these are ripples from that day. But if we look wider and maybe further back in history, I want to suggest to you another date that changed the world. Today is the 2nd of April, 2023. But I want to suggest to you that the 2nd of April, 1502, is a very important date. 521 years ago today. But I bet you don't know why. What happened on the 2nd of April, 1502, I hear you ask. Why was that important? Well, on that day, a 15-year-old boy died in Ludlow Castle in Shropshire. His name was Arthur. Do you know who he was? Any suggestions? I'll tell you. Arthur was the older brother of the man we know as Henry VIII. If Arthur had not died 521 years ago today, at the age of 15, all of British history from that point on would very likely have been different. We would have had a Tudor King Arthur. Maybe not Henry VIII at all. Probably no Church of England. Maybe no civil war. And certainly a very different history of British rulers and Parliament in the years since. 2nd of April 1502, Prince Arthur died, meaning that his younger brother would become king. That day changed the world, although at the time they didn't know it. But I want to go back further still, and to talk now about some days that are far more significant than September the 11th, or the 2nd of February, 2nd of April 1502. I want to talk about the events of the 30th of March to the 5th of April, AD 33. What happened then? Well, on the 30th of March, 33 AD, Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey. He was welcomed by the crowds, as we heard in our reading just now. 4 days later, on the 3rd of April, he was crucified just outside Jerusalem. And 2 days after that, early in the morning on the 5th, his friends went to the tomb and found that his body had gone. Later in the day, so they tell us, they met Jesus face to face, alive again. And yes, we do know those dates exactly now. We know more about the 7 days at the end of Jesus' life than we do at almost any other period in the ancient world. If you want to know more, I heartily recommend this book, The Mystery of the Last Supper by Colin Humphreys, who does the work to work out when Passover would have been, and so nails down the date of Jesus' death and resurrection to the day. Those events in Jerusalem in AD 33 changed the world almost more than any others that you could think of. And those events matter, no matter who you are or what you believe. Today, you might be an atheist or an agnostic. You might be a Buddhist or a Christian or something else entirely. But if you live in Britain today, the events in Jerusalem in AD 33 have influenced your life in deeper ways than you could possibly imagine. I want to recommend to you another book which I recently read. It's this, The Air We Breathe. It's a great book and well worth reading. The full title is this, The Air We Breathe, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. Glenn Scrivener, who's the author, makes the case that all the things in the West that we love today and value, things like equality, compassion, consent, education, science, freedom, and progress, all these things which in our history in the West, they have come from Christianity and ultimately from Jesus. Let me give you an example. We take it for granted in our society that we should care for the weakest members of our society. Sometimes we're not great at that, but our health services and our social services exist to care for people in need, especially the very young and the very old. Many of us would not be here today without the medical attention we were given at birth. In the pandemic, we prioritized the most vulnerable in our society. We changed the very way that we lived to protect those most at risk from COVID, the elderly. And we assume that that kind of behavior is normal. But if we take the big picture and look out over history, we will see it's not normal at all. For example, let me tell you a little bit about Plato, an ancient Greek philosopher. When it comes to children, Plato said this. Well, he thought that in order to be worth rearing and growing, children must be malleable, disposed to virtue, and physically fit. If the child did not prove themselves worthy, and especially if they were sick, parents, said Plato, should properly dispose of their children in secret, so that no one will know what has become of them. Plato wasn't the only person to think that kind of thing. Around the world and down through history, the vast majority of cultures have considered that we are better off without the weak. And then Jesus came along and made himself weak for us. Jesus gave himself up and died on our behalf. He was strong, but became weak for us, for you and me. According to the Bible, you have never seen anything more divine than that crucified man. Why do we care for the weak in our society? Because of Jesus and the movement that he started. Because in the West, our cultures and our cherished beliefs come from Christianity, even though our culture today has largely forgotten it. Through his life and his death, Jesus taught us to care for the weak. It's second nature to us, but it's come from Jesus. In the West, we are far more Christian than we realize. But we wouldn't remember Jesus at all if it wasn't for the events of the 30th of March to the 5th of April, 33. This coming week, across the world, and here at St. Faith's, Christians are remembering that last week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. Today we remember Palm Sunday, the day Jesus came to Jerusalem, the chief city of his people. And that day there were two crowds of people, two different groups. The first crowd had come with Jesus from Galilee, the place 40 miles up north, where most of Jesus' ministry took place. Those people, this crowd, they had heard Jesus speak. They'd seen the miracles he had done, and they had travelled with him from Galilee south to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. And on Palm Sunday, as Jesus came to Jerusalem, the crowd welcomed Jesus as their king. Today, if our king came to our town, we would probably line the streets and wave flags. Back then, they cut palm branches down from the trees and waved those. They laid their cloaks on the ground for him to walk on. They shouted, quoting from the Old Testament, from the Psalms, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." David was the most famous king the Israelites had ever had. The Son of David, they're saying that's Jesus. If your dad's the king, if your ancestor's a king, you're king as well. The crowd are welcoming Jesus as their king that day. Jesus played up to this. He could have simply walked into the city, but no, he chose to ride into the city on a donkey. Jesus knew what was going on that day. It's another sign from the Hebrew Bible. The prophet Zechariah in the Old Testament wrote about the king coming, humble and mounted on a donkey. Jesus said that day, "I am the king." He didn't use words to say it. He used actions. I am the King coming to my city, says Jesus. And the crowds waved their palm branches and shouted and cheered and put their cloaks on the ground because they also believed that this was the King coming to his city at last. But there was a second group of people that day. Not the group that had come with Jesus from Galilee and had seen what Jesus had done. These were the people who lived in Jerusalem. Matthew tells us this. When he entered Jerusalem, the whole crowd was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." The crowds from up north were celebrating. The people of Jerusalem were in turmoil. The whole city was stirred up. Who is this man? They were asking themselves. What is he doing? What does he want? As we journey towards Easter this week, we will find out that what Jesus wants to do is die, as weird as that might seem to us. He wants to give his life for them, for me, for you. That's what was going on in Jerusalem in March AD 33. These are events that shook the world over centuries. Over 2,000 years. These are events that ripple around the world today as people claim to follow this man who entered Jerusalem on a donkey that day. These are events that ripple as people claim to live for him, to serve him, as people claim that their lives have been changed by him. We all, even if we're not believers, even if you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, because of the revolution that Jesus started, we all live in the light of Easter. So if you live locally and you'd like to, I encourage you, get involved with our Easter events this week. Use these as an opportunity to encounter this story again. Use this week, these moments, to deepen your relationship with God. Or maybe even to get to know Jesus for the first time. Of all the events that we might talk about today, which have shaken the world, this week leading to Good Friday and then to Easter Day, these are events that have shaped the world more than anything else. And they can shape and change our lives too, for the better. The best thing that I ever did was the day that I decided to follow Jesus for myself. So as we approach Easter, who is this man? What is he doing? What does he want? Well, he is the King coming to his people. He is the one telling them about God and his kingdom. And he, Jesus, is coming to die for us all. In a moment, the kids hopefully will join us again. Bridget, could you go and ask them to come back? But let's just take a moment to be quiet, and I don't mean silence because we've got kids present. Let's just take a moment to be quiet and reflect for a moment. Leave that picture on the screen. Who do you think Jesus is? Can you see how the revolution that he started has influenced you and your life? A moment to be quiet.